What's up everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I've covered this war strike by strike, week by week, for months now, but I want to do something different today. Zoom all the way out and look at the actual numbers behind this entire conflict since it started back on February 28th. When you add up every phase of this war, the initial campaign, the ceasefire, the collapse, and everything since, Iran has launched somewhere in the range of thousands upon thousands of ballistic missiles and drones across multiple countries. And despite losing the overwhelming majority of them to interception, despite the US and Israel claiming Iran's missile capability is functionally destroyed, Iran is still firing. Let's break down what the actual numbers tell us. I'll walk through how this missile campaign has evolved in scale and intensity across each phase of the war, then the interception numbers and what they tell you, then the human cost across every country involved, then the running out of missiles narrative and why Iran keeps proving it wrong, and finish with my take on what these numbers actually mean for how this war ends. On day one of this war, back in late February, Iran fired around 80 missiles at Israel alone. That number climbed and fell in waves throughout the opening phase. Roughly 650 ballistic missiles hit Israel across the first 12 days of fighting, according to Times of Israel's own tracking, with an interception rate around 90%, consistent with Iran's earlier 2024 attacks. But Israel was never the only target. In the first 24 hours of the broader conflict, Iran fired 167 missiles and 541 drones at the UAE alone. And by the time analysts tallied the war's early numbers across all fronts, Iran had distributed fire across 13 different countries, with the UAE absorbing more total projectiles, 1,468, than Israel itself at 392. When the war resumed after the ceasefire collapsed, the pace accelerated even further in short bursts. Jerusalem Post's own tracking found approximately 2,110 missiles fired in just 10 days during one specific phase of renewed fighting, with over 60% of Iran's launchers destroyed in that same window. Layer every phase of this war together, the original campaign, the ceasefire collapse, the Strait crisis, the bridge and infrastructure campaign, and the most recent Jordan and Kuwait exchanges I've covered in my last two videos, and you're looking at a missile and drone campaign that's easily run into the thousands upon thousands of total launches over the course of this year, which is exactly the kind of grinding sustained number that title is getting at. Here's what I think is actually the most important statistic in this entire war. CENTCOM's own count puts more than 6,000 targets struck inside Iran and more than 90 Iranian vessels destroyed or damaged. On the defensive side, Bahrain alone claimed to have intercepted 74 missiles within days during one specific wave. Kuwait engaged 97 ballistic missiles in the first 24 hours of one phase alone. That's an extraordinary amount of coordinated multinational air defense work sustained over months. Jordan, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel all running their own intercept operations simultaneously, night after night, for the better part of a year now. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs confirmed at one point that Iranian ballistic missile launches were down 86% from day one levels, and separate analysis found Iran's daily launch rate against the UAE specifically collapsing from an average of 58 missiles a day in the opening days down to just 10 by day 4 of that phase. Al Jazeera's own reporting captured this pattern precisely. In the first 24 hours of one specific stretch of the conflict, Iran fired 167 missiles and 541 drones at the UAE. By day 15 of that same stretch, it was down to 4 missiles and 6 drones. That's roughly a 92% collapse in fire rate. And it's why you've seen repeated declarations from the White House that Iran's ballistic missile capacity is functionally destroyed. This is the actual question behind this entire video's title, and Al Jazeera posed it directly too. Despite those dramatic declines and the repeated declarations of Iran's capability being destroyed, Iran kept shooting, missiles landing on Qatar, a fatal strike on a car in Abu Dhabi, drone fires in Dubai and Fujairah. Defense analyst Colby Badwar's assessment that the declining daily rate reflected Iran running out of launchers rather than running out of will is the key to understanding this entire pattern. Iran entered this war with somewhere around 2,500 ballistic missiles by most Israeli intelligence estimates, and the actual constraint has never really been political will. To keep fighting, it's been the physical, mechanical bottleneck of transporter erector launchers. The vehicles needed to actually fire these things, getting destroyed faster than Iran can replace them. That distinction matters enormously for understanding everything I've covered in my last two videos on the Jordan and Kuwait strikes. Iran firing only a handful of missiles instead of dozens doesn't mean Iran has decided to de-escalate. It means Iran is working with a fraction of the launch capacity it started this war with, and is choosing to use what's left on specific, deliberately chosen targets, U.S. bases in Jordan, infrastructure in Kuwait, tankers in the Strait, rather than broad, unfocused barrages. That's actually more concerning in some ways than the early chaos. It suggests a more deliberate, rationed use of a shrinking but still functional capability, rather than Iran simply being unable to fight back at all. I want to give you the actual casualty picture because I don't think a single number captures how widely this war has spread its costs. Harana's cumulative tracking puts Iranian deaths at 3,636, broken down as 1,221 military, 701 civilian, and 714 unclassified, though US and Israeli estimates run considerably higher, 6,000 or more, with injury estimates ranging from 15,000 up to 26,500 depending on whose count you use. NPR's reporting specifically flagged 168 children among Iran's own claimed death toll of more than 3,000, and noted the U.S. military still hadn't completed its review of a strike on a girls' school that killed 14 adults alongside schoolchildren, a detail that deserves to be treated with real seriousness rather than buried under the broader statistics. On the Israeli side, the cumulative toll sits at roughly 57 deaths and over 7,000 wounded across the war's phases. Lebanon's toll, driven mostly by Hezbollah's involvement, stands at more than 4,219 killed. American forces have taken real losses too, more than 420 wounded according to Al Jazeera's cumulative count, the majority from traumatic brain injuries, alongside the confirmed combat deaths I've covered in recent videos. And I don't want to skip past the humanitarian infrastructure damage either. Roughly 10,000 people were left without drinking water after strikes destroyed a desalination plant, with a second plant on Keshem Island damaged just last month, a detail that connects directly to everything I covered in my video on Iran's broader infrastructure campaign. I want to dig deeper into the transporter erector launcher issue, because I think it's the single most important technical detail for understanding this entire war's trajectory, and it deserves more than a passing mention. A ballistic missile sitting in a warehouse or a tunnel, no matter how many thousands of them a country has stockpiled, is useless without a functioning launcher to actually fire it. TELs are large, specialized vehicles, expensive to build, slow to replace, and because they have to physically move into position, expose themselves, and fire, they're inherently more vulnerable to detection and destruction than the missiles themselves, which can be stored deep underground in the kind of hardened tunnel networks I've covered extensively in my other videos on this war. That's exactly why the IDF's assessment that Iran retained only 100 to 200 active launchers, even while potentially still possessing over 1,000 missiles in storage, is such a critical piece of context. It tells you Iran's actual bottleneck isn't inventory, it's delivery capacity. Destroying 60% of Iran's launchers in 10 days, as Jerusalem Post's tracking documented, doesn't destroy 60% of Iran's missiles. It destroys 60% of Iran's ability to fire whatever missiles remain. That distinction explains perfectly why you'd see exactly the pattern this war has produced. A dramatic collapse in daily fire rate that looks like Iran running out of missiles, while Iran continues finding ways to fire smaller numbers of missiles from whatever launchers survive for months longer than the functionally destroyed declarations suggested would be possible. It also explains the strategic logic behind CENTCOM's own targeting priorities throughout this war. If your actual goal is ending Iran's ability to threaten the region with ballistic missiles, you get far more value systematically hunting down and destroying mobile, hard-to-replace launchers than you do trying to locate and destroy every individual missile in a dispersed, tunnel-protected stockpile, which circles back directly to the tunnel reopening story I covered in an earlier video. Iran can dig its way back into a bombed storage facility with a bulldozer, but rebuilding a destroyed TL requires an entirely different, far more industrially demanding process that can't be replicated with basic construction equipment. I think it's worth breaking down exactly how this fire has actually been distributed, because the 13 countries figure I mentioned earlier deserves more than a single sentence. The UAE has absorbed the largest single share of projectiles among the regional players, 1,468 according to the tracking I cited earlier, more than Israel itself, which is a genuinely underappreciated fact, given how much of the war's coverage understandably centers on the Israel-Iran dimension specifically. Saudi Arabia recorded 2 deaths, and Bahrain 2 more, with over 35 injured there. Kuwait recorded at least 3 deaths in that same early tracking window, a number that's since grown given the additional Kuwait casualty I covered in my last video on the most recent Jordan and Kuwait exchange. Jordan has emerged as one of the most persistently targeted locations throughout this entire conflict, with Muwafaq Salti Air Base absorbing repeated, distinct missile attacks across different phases of the war. Not a single incident, but a recurring pattern stretching from earlier strikes back in June through the attack I covered just this week. Lebanon's toll, driven primarily by Hezbollah's direct involvement rather than Iranian missiles specifically, has become genuinely staggering, over 4,119 killed, a figure that reflects just how much this conflict expanded beyond a narrow Iran-Israel-US triangle into a true multi-front regional war involving Iran's proxy network as much as Iran itself. Each of these countries has its own distinct story within this broader statistical picture, its own political calculus about continued involvement, and its own domestic pressures shaped by how many of these projectiles have actually landed on their own territory versus been intercepted overhead. There's a specific technical detail from the Times of Israel's own reporting that I think deserves to be pulled out and explained on its own, because it's easy to skim past a single sentence buried in a larger statistics roundup. More than half of the ballistic missiles Iran fired at Israel during the war's opening phase carried cluster bomb warheads, munitions that release many smaller bomblets across a wide area, rather than concentrating damage at a single impact point. Cluster munitions carry a specific, well-documented humanitarian concern beyond their immediate blast effect. Unexploded bomblets can remain live and dangerous for years after a conflict ends, creating a lingering hazard for civilians long after the missiles themselves stop flying. That detail matters for understanding the full scope of what these missile numbers actually represent beyond the immediate casualty figures I've already covered. A war that's seen hundreds of cluster warhead missiles fired into populated and semi-populated areas is a war that's likely left behind a meaningful unexploded ordnance problem that will continue posing risk long after any eventual ceasefire holds, similar in some ways to the unexploded GBU-57 concerns I flagged in my videos on the Bunker Buster campaign, except distributed across a far wider geographic area and affecting ordinary civilian areas rather than isolated military and nuclear facilities specifically. I also want to bring in a detail I haven't covered in any of my other videos on this war. The UN Security Council actually adopted a formal resolution condemning Iran's attacks on its Gulf neighbors, passing 13-0 with China and Russia abstaining rather than exercising their veto power. That's a genuinely significant diplomatic data point sitting underneath all of these military statistics. China and Russia have historically been Iran's most reliable diplomatic protectors on the Security Council, willing to block or water down resolutions critical of Tehran. Choosing to abstain, rather than veto a resolution explicitly condemning Iran's attacks against Gulf states, tells you that even Iran's traditional great power backers weren't willing to spend political capital shielding Tehran from formal international condemnation over this specific pattern of behavior, striking civilian shipping and Gulf infrastructure rather than purely military targets. That's worth remembering every time you look at the raw missile and casualty numbers in isolation, because it tells you this conflict hasn't just strained Iran's relationship with the US, Israel, and its immediate Gulf neighbors. It's also visibly strained the patience of the two permanent Security Council members who'd normally be expected to run interference for Iran diplomatically. A unanimous or near-unanimous Security Council condemnation, even a symbolic one without binding enforcement mechanisms, represents a real, documented erosion of Iran's international standing over the course of this war, layered on top of everything else I've covered about the domestic, economic, and political pressure the regime is simultaneously managing. I think it's worth being honest about something before wrapping up. Pulling together a single, precise, cumulative missile count across an entire year-long multi-phase war involving over a dozen countries, multiple ceasefires, and competing sources with very different incentives for how they report numbers is genuinely difficult to do with full precision. Iranian state media, US and Israeli military assessments, independent trackers like Harana, and individual country defense ministries each report their own numbers using their own methodologies, their own definitions of what counts as a launch versus an interception versus an impact, and often their own political incentives for rounding those numbers up or down. That's exactly why I built this video's headline figure as a reasonable aggregate estimate pulled from multiple documented phase totals rather than citing one single clean source claiming an exact cumulative count. Because, as far as I can tell, no single authoritative source has published one unified number covering the entire war's duration across every country involved. I think that's actually an important takeaway in its own right. A war this large, this geographically distributed, and this long-running produces exactly the kind of fog that makes even basic statistical accounting genuinely difficult. Oh, and I'd rather be upfront about that uncertainty than present a false sense of precision about numbers that are, by their nature, still being reconciled and disputed even months after many of these individual strikes happened. All right, here's where I land on this. The numbers tell a genuinely two-sided story. On one hand, the interception rates and the launcher attrition are real, measurable, and dramatic. Iran's raw capacity to launch mass missile barrages has collapsed by something like 90% from where it started. And that's a legitimate, verified military achievement sustained across multiple Allied air defense networks working in close coordination for the better part of a year. On the other hand, The fact that Iran is still finding missiles to fire, still hitting new targets in Jordan and Kuwait as recently as this week, tells you that functionally destroyed and completely eliminated are two very different things. And this war has repeatedly proven the gap between those two descriptions matters enormously for anyone trying to predict when this actually ends. I think the honest read, based on everything in these numbers, is that Iran's capacity for the kind of massive, sustained barrage we saw in the war's opening days is genuinely gone. But its capacity for smaller, deliberately targeted strikes against specific, symbolically or strategically chosen targets appears to be enduring far longer than anyone predicted, back when those functionally destroyed declarations started getting made. That's exactly the dynamic I've been tracking across my last several videos, and I don't think the raw numbers alone are going to resolve this war. What happens next depends much more on whether either side's political will outlasts the other's remaining physical capability. I also want to address something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in most coverage of this war's numbers: the sheer financial cost of running sustained multi-country air defense operations against this volume of incoming fire for the better part of a year. Every single interception, whether it's a Patriot battery, THAAD, Iron Dome, or any of the other systems deployed across this theater, involves firing an interceptor missile that itself costs real money, often a substantial fraction of what the incoming threat costs to produce, sometimes considerably more. Multiply that by the thousands of intercepts documented across Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel throughout this entire war, and you're looking at an air defense expenditure that easily runs into the billions of dollars, layered directly on top of the 37. $5 billion figure Hegseth disclosed to Congress that I covered in an earlier video, a figure that itself only captured direct U.S. military operational costs, not the parallel expenditure every other country in this coalition has been absorbing simultaneously to defend their own airspace. That's exactly the kind of hidden, cumulative cost that doesn't show up in a single dramatic headline the way a missile strike or a casualty figure does, but that compounds relentlessly with every single night this war continues. A defense posture built around intercepting expensive threats with expensive interceptors is sustainable in the short term, but every additional week, this war grinds on adds real pressure on defense budgets across an entire coalition of countries, not just the United States, which is worth factoring into any honest assessment of how much longer every party involved can realistically sustain the current pace of this conflict before the financial strain itself starts becoming a genuine factor in decision-making, separate entirely from the human and political costs I've already covered throughout this video. So that's the war in numbers: thousands of missiles and drones fired across 13 countries, interception rates above 90% sustained for months, a documented 86 to 92% collapse in Iran's daily fire rate, and thousands of deaths spread across Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and the Gulf states. Despite all of that, Iran fired missiles at Jordan and Kuwait this week, proving once again that degraded isn't the same as defeated. I'll keep tracking the numbers as this war continues. Let me know in the comments what statistic from this video surprised you most, and hit subscribe if you want these breakdowns as they come. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.